Please hear the reading of the gospel from Matthew chapter 13, verses 53 to 58. And when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there, and coming to his own country, he taught them in their synagogues so that they were astonished, and said, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all this?" And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own country and in his own house." And he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Lessons from the life of Martin Luther King Jr. On April the 4th, 1968, my father came to pick me up from the downtown YMCA in El Paso, Texas, where I had been participating in activities there. Since it was kind of late at night, my dad wanted to save me the trouble of having to catch the bus back home. He had done this before, but this time there was something different. When I got into the car that night, my dad told me that Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated that day. I could hear the somberness, the dejection, and the resignation in his voice. El Paso, Texas, where I grew up, is a border town. To the west is New Mexico. To the south is the country of Mexico. I did not realize it at the time growing up, but because we were at the extreme edge of Texas, we were pretty much insulated from the more virulent racism of other parts of Texas, and certainly from what was going on at that time in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia and other parts of the South. But we were still aware of what was happening through television and through what we were told in the classroom. Actually, what I heard about Martin Luther King Jr. in my elementary school classroom was not very positive. King and the other protesters were often portrayed as troublemakers. None of my teachers spent any time explaining to me and my classmates the significance of Martin Luther King Jr. and what he was doing and why he was doing it. I had to learn those lessons on my own at a later time. I learned that Martin Luther King Jr. was a man ahead of his times. He was a prophet of social justice, a drum major for truth. He was one of those rare individuals who stood at the crossroads of time and created a new era. Like Jesus split time into BC and AD, Martin Luther King Jr. split time into pre-King and post-King. Of course, King was not accepted and supported by everyone, especially those who wanted to maintain the status quo. But still, one of my great surprises was that despite his greatness and despite his significance, Martin Luther King Jr. was not even accepted and supported by everyone in his own community, the very people he was trying to help. In many ways, the experience of Martin Luther King Jr. echoed the experience of Jesus of Nazareth, whom he preached about. Jesus himself said it this way: a prophet is not without honor, except in his own country and in his own house. In the Gospel of Matthew, we see Jesus starting his ministry with a whirlwind tour of Galilee. This tour was a series of great accomplishments. First, there was this great Sermon on the Mount. And then he brought healing to a man afflicted with leprosy. In the city of Capernaum, he effected a long-distance healing of the slave of a Roman centurion. And then he paused long enough to heal the mother-in-law of Simon Peter by removing her fever. And then there was this incident on the boat, when in the presence of his frightened disciples out there on the water, he spoke calm to the turbulent wind and waves, and the wind and the waves obeyed him. And then there was the liberation of the two men afflicted with demon possession in the country of the Gadarenes. And even before all of these and other notable miracles, Jesus' reputation had already spread all throughout Syria after he healed multitudes of people of numerous afflictions, and great crowds followed him from Galilee, the Decapolis, and Jerusalem, and the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. After such a grand opening, there was just one other phase for Jesus and his disciples, and that was to take his glorious miracle tour to his hometown of Nazareth. It was something he had been looking forward to. He had great expectations. It would have been the hometown boy returning home. But things did not turn out that way. Instead, there were questions. There was non-acceptance. There was rejection. Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works, they asked. Their hearts just could not accept what their eyes saw and their ears heard. They refused to let go of the memory of the hometown boy they always known. Jesus grew up, but they didn't. Jesus was now giving them the opportunity to grow up, but they refused the opportunity because in order to grow up, they had to change their minds about Jesus. And this was a challenge they failed to meet. Martin Luther King Jr. also returned one day to his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. It was in December 1959, and he did it after a series of accomplishments that established his reputation and brought him to the national stage. He successfully led the 385-day Montgomery bus boycott after Claudette Colvin in the month of March and Rosa Parks 9 months later were taken into custody for refusing to give up their seat to white men on a segregated bus. He was then elected president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957 in Montgomery, Alabama, and in the 1957 Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom, he addressed a national audience for the first time. He published his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, the Montgomery Story, in that same year. And in 1958, while doing a book signing, he survived an attack by Izola Curry, who stabbed him in the chest with a letter opener. That was not a good way to enhance one's reputation, but it enhanced his reputation nevertheless. After all of that, King Jr. returned to his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, to join his father as co-pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. But even though he returned as an accomplished son with a national reputation, he still encountered hostility. After King returned home in 1959, the governor of Georgia sent out to tarnish his reputation and the reputation of the civil rights movement. The governor said wherever King went, a crime wave followed. Shortly after that, King was arrested for driving in Georgia with an Alabama driver's license, even though it was not illegal to drive in Georgia with an Alabama driver's license. They could not accept King for who he was and what he represented. They did not want to accept King for who he was and what he represented. King had grown up, but the Atlanta he came back home to had not grown up. In order to grow up, they had to change their minds about Martin Luther King Jr. That was a challenge they failed to meet. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. was not Jesus. He would have been the first to admit that. But yet the parallels between their lives are remarkable. Both of them confronted people with the need to change, not just at the hometown level, but eventually at the worldwide level. And that is still the case today. And of course, that is no accident, since Martin Luther King Jr. based his ministry and message upon the ministry and message of Jesus. So we actually have more than a parallel here. We have a continuation of what Jesus stood for and what Martin Luther King Jr. stood for. Martin Luther King Jr. was not Jesus, but he was a witness for Jesus. So that raises the question for us, born in the 20th and 21st centuries, what do we do with what Martin Luther King Jr. stood for? Among Martin Luther King Jr.'s most notable and transformative achievements was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, gender, national origin, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited barriers to voting, such as literary tests. The Voting Rights Act and voting rights are now under severe attack, beginning with the Supreme Court gutting of the Voting Rights Acts about 8 years ago and by state lawmakers today. What do we do with what Martin Luther King Jr. stood for? King Jr. came back home to Atlanta, and he was not well received by everyone. Jesus came back home to Nazareth, and he was not well received by everyone. What King and Jesus share in common here is that their coming home presented the hometown folks with a marvelous opportunity, an opportunity for transformation that they allowed to slip through their fingers. To the people of Nazareth, Jesus was ordinary. They wanted him to stay ordinary. Stay in your place. To the people of Atlanta, King was ordinary. They wanted him to stay ordinary. Stay in your place. There is a lesson here for the hometown folks. That lesson is that opportunity often comes in the disguise of the ordinary. To the people of Galilee, Jesus was ordinary. They at least wanted him to be ordinary. He was from an ordinary family. To some of the people of Atlanta, King was ordinary. They at least wanted him to be ordinary. He was from an ordinary family. They did not recognize the greatness he represented. God continues to bring opportunities to all of us. But sometimes these opportunities are disguised as the ordinary. And what this means is that we must train our spiritual eyes. We must train our spiritual hearts to look beyond the ordinary and see God's opportunity. A second lesson we learn from the life of Martin Luther King Jr. is that justice cannot be defeated. We also learned this from Jesus. But let's just return to what the gospel says. The people question, is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? Are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? Are not all of his sisters right here with us? Where did he get all of this stuff? They knew Jesus' family, and Jesus' family was still with them. And the implication was that Jesus should be no more than they were. The family in ancient times had the same important role that families have today. But there is some difference. The family established one's identity. The family determined one's place in the society. And no one was expected to break out of the mold set for them by their family. Jesus broke out of the mold that was determined by his family. That's why they refused to accept Jesus in his hometown. He did not stay within the parameters that was set by his family. Some of you may experience this when you return home after graduating from Azusa Pacific University. Some of you may experience this even before you graduate. There will always be those who will celebrate your achievement, and there will be those who will resent your achievement because you broke out of the mold. You did not stay in your place. Don't be discouraged by all of this. Don't allow anyone to discourage you from growing up and aiming high. Not even if they are your hometown folks. Not even if they are members of your own family. There is a sense in which Martin Luther King Jr. did stay within the parameters set by his family. His grandfather was a Baptist minister. His father was a Baptist minister. He became a Baptist minister. His grandfather and grandmother were social activists. His father and mother were social activists. He became a social activist. But yet there was something different about Martin Luther King Jr., and it was not that he graduated with a Bachelor of Divinity from Crozer Theological Seminary. It was not that he graduated with a Ph.D. in systematic theology from Boston University. It was that he was chosen for a particular moment in history. He did not choose the moment. The moment chose him. Or to say it the way his preacher's heart would say it, God chose him. It is amazing how these moments occur. Rosa Parks refused to relinquish her seat on a bus, and she was arrested. That created a moment. And then that moment created the Martin Luther King Jr. that we know today. He did not choose the moment. The moment chose him. God chose him. Rosa Parks did not choose the moment. The moment chose her. God chose her. In the year 2020, we had a moment. It was a moment born out of tragedy. It was a moment born out of the senseless, callous, unnecessary killing of an African-American man named George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And it was not just that one tragedy. It was a series of tragedies that led up to that one moment. And there are names associated with these tragedies. Rodney King, Taisha Miller, Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many more. Much too many more. The protests broke out all over the country and even overseas, and they had a driving theme. That theme was Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. There was no one leader for this movement. There was no one headquarters for this movement. The leadership was decentralized and widespread. The movement was led by a younger generation. The movement was led by your generation. In recent times, we have seen people held accountable for crimes committed against people because of their race, skin color, or ethnic heritage. We have never seen this much accountability in one place at the same time. What this shows is that justice can be attacked, justice can be assaulted, justice can be delayed, but justice cannot be defeated. Martin Luther King Jr. said that the universe is on the side of justice. He said this when he was talking to a mixed audience. When he was in church, he just said that God is on the side of justice. He explained that there is a moral structure to the universe. If you want to be on the winning side, be on the side of justice. In 1957, shortly after the Montgomery bus boycott, King was speaking to an audience of young people from the YMCA and the YWCA at the University of California in Berkeley. He realized that he was talking to a mixed group. There were those who were believers, there were those who were non-believers, those who believed in God, those who did not believe in God. So here is how King handled that. He said, quote, "I am quite aware of the fact that there are persons who firmly believe in nonviolence, who do not believe in a personal God. But I think every person who believes in nonviolent resistance believes somehow that the universe in some form is on the side of justice. That there is something unfolding in the universe, whether one speaks of it as an unconscious process, or whether one speaks of it as some unmoved mover, or whether someone speaks of it as a personal God. There is something in the universe that unfolds for justice. And so in Montgomery, we felt somehow that as we struggled, we had cosmic companionship. And this was one of the things that kept the people together, the belief that the universe is on the side of justice." Unquote. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus said, "Blessed are they that hunger and thirst for the kaiosune, for they shall be filled." We many times translate that Greek word dikaiosune as righteousness, but a more accurate translation of dikaiosune is justice. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they shall be filled. Martin Luther King Jr. was not Jesus, but one thing they had in common is that they were both drum majors for justice. Lesson 1, opportunity often comes in the disguise of the ordinary. Lesson 2, justice cannot be defeated. A third lesson we learn from the life of Martin Luther King Jr. and from Jesus before him is that it is what happens in the long term that matters the most. Let me remind us of what the Gospel of Matthew says. And they took offense at him, but Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and in his own house. And he did not do any mighty works there because of their unbelief. To me, this is the most intriguing aspect of this passage. For all appearances, on the surface at least, Jesus' foray into his hometown ended in disappointment and failure. What he did in the rest of the country, he did not do. He could not do in his own hometown of Nazareth because of their unbelief. This was not an auspicious beginning as far as appearances with. It seemed like a disappointing setback. Martin Luther King Jr. also had his share of setbacks and disappointments. We tend to overlook those in light of his accomplishments, the March on Washington, the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. But King's path was marked with disappointment, setback, and tragedy. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, the bombing of King's own house in Montgomery, the state-sponsored violence at the Edmunds-Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday, the disappointing campaign for housing and in Chicago, setbacks, tragedies, disappointments. But what we learn from Jesus and his servant Martin Luther King Jr. is what happens in the long term that makes the difference. Setbacks, disappointment, tragedies, they are only short-term experiences. It's what they lead to that matters. What strikes me as we observe the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. is that the experiences of Jesus and the experiences of King were similar, and that both sets of experiences were a mixed bag, a mixture of glorious accomplishment and disappointing setbacks. But that is speaking only in the short term. When we look at things in the long term, the accomplishments prove to be stepping stones to even greater accomplishments, and the setbacks proved to be doors of opportunity in disguise. And in the end, both these accomplishments and those setbacks merge together to make a difference. So what does that mean for you and me? What I've just described is just the way things are in life, the way things are in your life and will be in your life. You will have great accomplishments, and even if they're not so great, they'll still be pretty cool. And you will have miserable setbacks. But it is all the same. Your accomplishments will be stepping stones to greater accomplishments, and your setbacks will only be open doors in disguise. And in the end, they will all come together and merge together to make a difference. And if the truth be told, it is our setbacks and failures that really concern us. So I submit this to you. Let's take a lesson from Jesus. Let's take a lesson from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Don't be deceived by your failures and setbacks. For that matter, don't be deceived by your successes and your accomplishments. They are only short term. It is what they lead to in the long term that matters. That is what counts. That is what makes the difference. Our lives are a mixed bag, but it is the mix that makes the difference. It is regrettable but true. Many of us will be on the receiving end of injustice. It will look and feel like we are powerless to do anything about it. But that is only a deception. There is power to overcome and dismantle injustice. That power is first of all in our faith in God, and that power is secondly in our unity. So when the call comes to stand against injustice, answer the call. There is no doubt that justice will prevail. God is on the side of justice. My prayer is that we will be on the side of God. And so, go with God.